In the presence of all the passengers in first class, an elderly man walking with a cane was quietly asked to leave the seat he had paid for in full. No anger, no argument. He simply took out his phone, dialed a familiar number, and with one single call, he shook the foundations of a giant airline corporation. This wasn't just a story about a plane ticket. It was a story about dignity, about the power of patience, and how an ordinary person can change an entire system just through the weight of their silence. If you believe that steadfastness can lead to great things, like on this video, share this story with more people, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more emotional journeys with us. And now, let's begin the story of him. Leonard Brooks. He boarded the plane with a calm smile, holding his first-class ticket and familiar walking cane. Mr. Leonard Brooks greeted the flight attendants, lightly found his seat, and quietly opened his newspaper. But just a few minutes later, a flight attendant approached her gaze, scrutinizing her voice filled with doubt. She didn't ask twice, nor did she hesitate requesting that he leave his seat before the eyes of all the passengers. What she didn't know was that the quiet man she had just embarrassed was not an ordinary passenger. He was one of the founding members of the airline, and before this flight landed, her world would begin to crumble. They had said it was just a routine check, a minor mistake, nothing personal. But when Leonard boarded this flight, holding his ticket and cane, he never expected to become the center of a storm. At 74, with sharp eyes, he wore a neat gray suit and polished black shoes. Leonard walked slowly but steadily toward seat 1A in first class. A few passengers glanced at him, some nodded politely. Others simply observed in silence. He responded with a slight nod, placing his leather briefcase under the seat before sitting down comfortably in the spacious seat. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was peaceful, with soft murmurs of conversation, blending with the gentle clinking of cups and glasses. Leonard adjusted his glasses, opened the newspaper as if he had been accustomed to such flights for a long time. He didn't glance around or try to draw attention. He just wanted a peaceful trip. The seat next to him was empty, and he seemed to enjoy the moment. A few rows behind a couple was chatting quietly. On the other side of the aisle, a young man was engrossed in his phone. Everything was normal until Ms. Vanessa Carter, a flight attendant, passed by Leonard and stopped. She stood there for a moment, her eyes narrowing, her arms crossed tightly in front of her, her smile fading. "Excuse me, sir," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Leonard looked up, his eyebrows slightly furrowed. His tone, calm. "Yes, 1A." Vanessa tilted her head, her expression still distrustful. "May I see your ticket?" Leonard calmly took the ticket from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to her without hesitation. Vanessa studied the ticket longer than necessary, flipping it over and over, her face unchanged. "This is a first-class ticket," she said in a dry voice. Leonard nodded slightly. "Yes, it is." But she didn't immediately return the ticket. Vanessa glanced around as if looking for support. By now, many passengers had begun to watch. A woman leaned her head and whispered to her husband. The tension in the air began to rise. "I need to confirm with the check-in desk," Vanessa said, not daring to look at Leonard. "Please wait here." Without waiting for a response, she quickly turned and walked toward the front of the plane, the sound of her high heels echoing with each tense step. Leonard remained seated, his hands clasped around his cane, his gaze straight ahead, his face unchanged, but there was a subtle difference in his expression. The look of someone who had seen this too many times and understood very well what was about to happen. In the plane's galley, Vanessa stood stiffly by the service phone, her fingers nervously tapping on the counter. Her jaw was clenched. A younger flight attendant, Ms. Emily Ward, approached holding 2 bottles of water. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked softly. Vanessa hesitated. "There's a man in 1A. Something doesn't seem right." Emily blinked. What do you mean? Doesn't seem right. He gave me a first-class ticket, but Vanessa trailed off, then leaned in to whisper, He doesn't seem like the kind of person who sits in that seat. Emily raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Vanessa avoided her colleague's gaze, shrugged. I'm not sure, it's just a feeling. Emily's expression shifted from gentle to cautious. If his ticket says 1A, then he's sitting in the right seat. Vanessa quickly picked up the phone, lowering her voice. Please confirm first-class reservation for Leonard Brooks, seat 1A. A voice on the other end responded, after a short pause. Vanessa tapped her fingers nervously on the counter while waiting. Confirmed. Fully paid, came the response. Vanessa hung up her face, expressionless. Emily frowned. So the ticket is valid, Vanessa muttered. Yes, it is. But instead of apologizing, she stood there, her gaze troubled. After a brief hesitation, she took a deep breath, straightened up, and made her way back to the first-class cabin. Her face was even more tense as she approached Leonard again. Sir, she said, her voice colder than before. We need you to come with us for further verification of your reservation. Leonard calmly folded his newspaper, his gaze steady, his eyes locking onto hers. Is there a problem? He asked, his voice soft but powerful, making Vanessa freeze. I can't discuss it here. She gestured for him to follow. The atmosphere in the cabin became even more silent. A man in seat 2B lowered his phone to listen. A woman on the other side of the aisle frowned in disapproval. Leonard slowly stood up, leaning slightly on his cane, briefly glancing back at the seat he was being asked to leave, then politely nodded to the surrounding passengers before following Vanessa down the aisle. His demeanor unruffled, Leonard Brooks calmly stood up, resting his hand on the sturdy cane. He glanced back at the seat he had been forced to leave, then looked around at the faces watching him intently. Without any sign of resistance, he politely nodded to the nearby passengers and silently followed Vanessa Carter down the aisle. His gait was slow, but exuded determination. Without saying a word, everyone could sense that he was neither flustered nor in any way intimidated. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin changed too. The peaceful silence that had once been there now became heavy and suffocating. A few passengers exchanged anxious glances. The man in seat 2B leaned toward the woman sitting next to him, whispering, He didn't do anything wrong. Why is he being kicked off? The woman shook her head, her expression one of disapproval. His ticket clearly says first class. I saw it. In the galley, Emily Ward stood by the curtain, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding ahead, her face tense. She didn't speak, but the anxious look in her eyes said it all. Something was very wrong. In the service area, Vanessa stood stiffly next to Leonard as he rested one hand against the small wall, the other still holding his cane. The cramped space made the situation even more awkward. We're still verifying your seat. Vanessa avoided his gaze, her voice uneasy in the meantime. Please wait here or move to the back of the plane. Leonard took a deep breath. I've shown you my ticket. Everything's been paid for and everything's been confirmed. Vanessa hesitated. Sometimes the system makes errors. It could be a technical glitch or last-minute changes. We just need to be sure. Leonard looked at her, his gaze neither angry nor harsh, just a calmness that was almost terrifying. And in the process of being sure, you chose to drag me out of my seat. She hesitated, her eyes shifting away. I'm just following procedure, Vanessa said, her voice tightening with each word. It's nothing personal. Leonard smirked slightly, his smile faint but his eyes cold. That's always the way people justify things. He slowly pulled a small black phone from his jacket pocket. Vanessa glanced at him as he dialed. Leonard's voice came out calm. Yes, it's happening again. Same situation. Seat 1A, first class. You handle it. He hung up immediately, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and his face remained unchanged, still as composed as if everything had been anticipated. Back in the first-class cabin, the whispers grew louder. The man in the navy blue jacket turned around, speaking quietly to a flight attendant walking by. "He's so polite. Why is he being asked to leave?" The attendant remained silent, walking quickly past her, face tense. Emily stood next to the curtain, watching the passengers. Her jaw clenched. She knew Vanessa had crossed the line, but speaking up now would only complicate things further. In the cockpit, the captain's phone rang. He picked it up, assuming it was just a routine call, but just seconds later his expression changed completely. "Yes, sir. Passenger 1A is on board." "I understand." The captain paused and then added, "No, I wasn't informed beforehand." "I will handle it." He put the phone down and turned to the co-pilot, his voice serious. "We have a major issue." A high-ranking passenger was removed from first class without a valid reason. The co-pilot was stunned. "What do you mean?" The captain shook his head. "He's not an ordinary passenger." At the same time, in the service area, Vanessa's phone vibrated. She pulled it out, skimmed the screen, and immediately locked it. Her face paling, Leonard stood still, his gaze not leaving her. "Is something wrong?" he asked softly, but his voice carried weight. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but choked on her words. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I just received a notification. You may return to your seat. Everything has been confirmed." Leonard stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once slowly, turning and walking back toward first class. The sound of his cane tapping on the floor echoed through the tense silence of the cabin. Vanessa followed a few steps behind, her shoulders stiff. When Leonard returned to seat 1A, all eyes were on him. A few passengers whispered, while others simply watched in silence. Emily quickly stepped aside, her expression unreadable. Leonard paused before the seat, not sitting immediately but looking around the cabin before resting his gaze on Vanessa. She stopped in her tracks, unsure whether to continue or explain. "I will sit," Leonard said, his tone gentle but firm, "but I will not forget." He calmly sat down, opened his newspaper, disregarding the silent chaos unfolding around him. Vanessa hurried back to the galley, her breath heavy as if pressed down. She pulled out her phone and reread the message she had just received. The words were clear: Leonard Brooks, Executive Advisory Board, priority shareholder. Her throat tightened. She hadn't just humiliated a passenger. She had crossed paths with someone whom the entire airline held in the highest regard. Emily stood there, arms crossed, her voice calm but sharp. "You know who he is now, don't you?" Vanessa didn't answer right away. She leaned back against the counter, her eyes vacant. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Emily shook her head, sighed. "You didn't need to know who he is. You just needed to know how to treat all passengers with respect. A person's identity doesn't decide." Vanessa Carter turned her face away, her gaze evasive. In the first-class cabin, Leonard Brooks sat quietly. His face remained calm, but it was far from relaxed. The glass of water before him remained untouched, the newspaper unopened. He sat still, occasionally glancing over at passengers who pretended to be engrossed in books or phone screens, but their occasional furtive glances toward him did not escape his notice. Across the aisle, the man in the navy jacket leaned toward him. "Excuse me, sir," he whispered what just happened. "That wasn't right." Leonard slowly turned his head. "Not right," he answered softly. The man nodded, his face full of remorse. "I'm sorry." Leonard simply nodded back. "Thank you." Just then, a soft chime rang through the speakers, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be departing shortly. Please remain seated while the crew completes the final preparations." The familiar announcements this time carried an unusually heavy tone. The air in the cabin grew tense. Meanwhile, in the galley, Vanessa stood gripping the counter, her palms sweating. Emily Ward approached, her voice lowering. "You need to apologize to him properly." Vanessa glared at Emily. "He's already back in his seat." Emily shook her head. "That's not enough. You treated him like a problem in front of everyone." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but her phone vibrated again. A message from the captain appeared on the screen. "You need to meet him privately before landing. The operations team has been notified. Prepare to explain your actions." Vanessa's face went pale. Her trembling hand clenched around the phone. Meanwhile, Leonard sat lightly resting on his cane, his eyes looking out the window. The plane hadn't even left the ground yet, but a storm had silently begun to brew. He wasn't afraid. He was simply waiting. The plane started to roll down the runway, but the tension in the cabin hadn't eased. It hung heavily in the air, like a storm cloud. Vanessa remained in the galley trying to complete small tasks, but her hands no longer had any steadiness. The words, "prepare to explain your actions," kept echoing in her mind like a warning bell. Emily watched her for a long while, then finally approached, her tone firm. "You can't pretend this didn't happen." Vanessa bit her lips stubborn. "I didn't mean to offend him," Emily interrupted coldly. "You thought he didn't belong in that seat." Vanessa turned her face away, her jaw clenched. She hated being confronted with the truth, but deep down she knew Emily was right. Vanessa had judged Leonard by his appearance, made an immediate decision without checking anything else. And now the consequences weren't just hers to bear. They had reached the captain, the operations office, and perhaps even higher. In the first-class cabin, Leonard still sat in silence. His face gave nothing away. He didn't need to say anything more. His silence spoke louder than any words. The man in the navy jacket continued to watch him, then leaned in to ask quietly, "Sir, if it's not too much trouble, do you have a significant role with the airline?" Leonard turned his head, his tone calm. "I was one of the founding advisors of this airline." He paused for a moment, then added, "I'm still on the board of directors and hold a share." The man blinked, stunned. "You're one of the founders." Leonard nodded, once his gaze steady. "It's been 50 years. Whispers rippled through the rows around them. Passengers who overheard sat up straighter, their eyes filled with respect. The elderly woman in seat 1C leaned toward her husband, whispering something. Another man pulled out his phone, surreptitiously recording the scene. A short while later, Emily returned to the cabin. She walked slowly, checking the rows of seats. When she reached Leonard, she stopped, leaned down, and whispered softly, "Sir, I apologize for what happened earlier. I don't agree with how they treated you." Leonard looked at her for a few seconds, his eyes assessing, then nodded slightly. I noticed Emily stood up straight, offering a respectful smile, before walking away. From the front of the cabin, Vanessa watched the entire exchange. Her face was stiff, that small nod. The recognition given to Emily made Vanessa feel smaller than ever. Emily had done what she should have done an hour ago. Now a simple apology was no longer enough. As the plane took off, Vanessa quietly returned to the galley. She didn't check her phone, didn't speak to her colleagues. She just stood there like a silent shadow, unsure of what to say, to erase what had happened. In seat 1, Leonard sat calmly, his eyes focused on the window, where white clouds drifted by. His hand still rested lightly on the head of his cane, motionless like a statue. He had made a call, and now everything was just a matter of time. At an altitude of 30,000 feet, the plane glided smoothly through the sky, but inside the calm was only superficial. Beneath that calm, the undercurrent was swirling. Vanessa moved through the cabin, her smile rigid, her eyes always avoiding the first-class section. Every time she passed Leonard, her chest felt heavy. The passengers no longer pretended. Some looked at her with cold eyes, others remained silent, but all of them knew what had happened. Vanessa tried to focus on her work. She opened a drawer to get some snacks, but her hands still trembled. Thoughts swirled in her mind. Why had she assumed from the start that he didn't belong in that seat? Deep inside, she knew the answer. But admitting it was harder than anything, Emily walked into the galley again, holding an empty tray. She placed the tray down, her eyes locking onto Vanessa's. "So what now? Are you going to speak to him or remain silent until we land?" Vanessa muttered. "I've already let him return to his seat." Emily crossed her arms, her voice decisive. "You didn't let him do anything. He should never have been asked to leave his seat in the first place." Vanessa Carter turned her face away, but Emily Ward didn't let her evade. "You made this personal when it shouldn't have been. He wasn't loud. He wasn't rude. He didn't even argue with you." "That should have made you realize something," Vanessa mumbled, almost inaudible. "I didn't know who he was." Emily's voice dropped firm. "But you didn't need to know." The tension between the two lingered in silence. After a few seconds, Emily quietly lifted her tray and left, leaving Vanessa alone with her rising discomfort. In the first-class cabin, Leonard Brooks remained motionless. He flipped through a few pages of his hardcover book, but his eyes didn't truly follow the words. Occasionally, he'd lift his head, his gaze calm, observing every small movement around the cabin, like someone silently taking notes. Leonard's presence didn't require words or strong gestures, but it carried an undeniable weight. Across the aisle, the man in the navy jacket, now everyone knew he was a lawyer, opened his laptop, typed a few lines, then looked up at Leonard. "Excuse me, sir," he said earnestly. "I apologize again for what happened." Leonard nodded lightly, responding with a thank you, devoid of emotion. "Thank you, but this isn't the first time." The response made the man pause, fully absorbing the depth of what had just occurred. A little while later, Emily returned to the cabin carrying a tray of drinks. When she passed Leonard, she smiled politely. He responded with a slight nod, but his gaze drifted far off, looking out the small window. In the galley, Vanessa's phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen, and her heart tightened. The message from the captain this time was unmistakable. Confirmation. The operations office has identified him. They are preparing a response. Direct contact will be made upon landing. Prepare an official report. Vanessa gripped the tray's edge in front of her. There was no way out. She had once tried to justify the procedure, but now every procedure was becoming evidence to incriminate her. The plane continued to glide silently through the sky, but with each passing minute, Vanessa felt herself getting closer to the edge. The engine's hum, once soothing, now rang in her head, like the ticking of a countdown clock. As she walked down the aisles, she moved slower. Her head lowered, offering a forced smile as she served water to the passengers. She no longer initiated conversations, and there was no joy in her work. Every movement was stiff like a machine malfunctioning. Meanwhile, Leonard remained the picture of calm. He hadn't spoken another word since returning to seat 1A, but his silence carried a powerful presence. It made those who observed him even more uneasy, especially Vanessa. This wasn't the silence of someone defeated. It was the silence of someone who had already acted quietly, but decisively, beyond the reach of any late apology. The passengers in first class also stopped pretending indifference. The elderly woman in seat 1C occasionally glanced at Leonard, her eyes reflecting admiration. The man in 3A, who had silently observed from the beginning of the flight, opened his phone and began typing. Perhaps it was a post, a recount, an accusation, but surely it wouldn't fade into silence. Emily pushed a dessert tray down the aisle, stopping beside Leonard's seat. "Excuse me, sir, would you like anything else?" Leonard looked at her, then nodded slightly. "Black coffee." Emily quickly poured the coffee and handed it to him with both hands respectfully. If you need anything else, just press the call button." This time, Leonard looked at her longer, his gaze direct. "Since the beginning, you've treated me with respect. Thank you." Emily smiled softly. "That's what we're supposed to do." "Sir." Leonard nodded, accepted the coffee, and returned to his book. At the front of the cabin, Vanessa witnessed the exchange. She tightened her grip on the serving tray in her hands until her fingers went pale. She no longer controlled first class. She was now the one being quietly avoided by the whole cabin. As Vanessa turned to go back into the galley, an urgent message buzzed on the crew's device. "Urgent passenger, Leonard Brooks has submitted an incident report. The operations office has flagged the matter for review at the board level. Prepare an official report. Ground crew will meet upon landing." Vanessa felt the air rush out of her chest. It wasn't just a reminder. This was a hanging judgment over her head. Emily entered the galley right after her. With just a glance at Vanessa's face, she didn't need to ask anything more. Her voice dropped no longer. "Patient? He's already reported it." Vanessa whispered, her voice trailing off. I didn't mean to," Emily answered bluntly. "It doesn't matter whether you meant to or not. What matters is what you did. You didn't just humiliate a passenger. You hurt one of the people who helped build this airline." Vanessa said nothing. She stood frozen, her eyes glued to the screen, displaying the message as if it were an inescapable sentence. At that moment, in seat 1A, Leonard took a sip of his coffee. He was completely unperturbed by the slight vibrations of the plane. For him, this was just another familiar rhythm dignity stripped away in silence. Apologies arriving too late. Respect, given only when power compels people to notice. But this time, something was different. Leonard no longer silently passed by, as before. He had made a call. The rest of the story was already writing itself. The plane raced through the vast sky, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had completely shifted. The first-class cabin, once alive with conversations and the clinking of glasses, was now only filled with silent glances and quiet, unspoken thoughts. The passengers were no longer just travelers. They had become silent witnesses to something they could no longer pretend to ignore. Some whispered amongst themselves since takeoff, while others sat quietly, occasionally stealing glances toward the front, where Leonard Brooks sat calmly in seat 1A. Meanwhile, Vanessa Carter stood in the galley, her gaze blankly fixed on the metal drawer she had opened for the third time, still unable to remember what she was supposed to retrieve. Every small sound in the cabin made her jump. Each passing minute drew her closer to the moment when she would have to face the consequences, not just with the captain or her superiors, but with everyone whose name appeared at the top of the company's official documents. She kept replaying in her mind the initial moment, the tone of voice she had used, how she had stood towering over him, how she grabbed his ticket without even properly looking at it and made her decision. At the time, she thought she was just doing her duty. But now, as every layer of justification peeled away, the truth was clear. She hadn't followed procedure. She hadn't verified anything. She just looked at Leonard and decided he didn't belong there. Emily Ward returned to the galley holding an empty tray. "They just requested more coffee in row 2, she said, her voice dry. Vanessa looked at her eyes pleading for some sign of forgiveness, some trace of understanding. But Emily only responded with cold disappointment. "I wasn't planning to let this go this far," Vanessa murmured, her voice barely audible. Emily glanced at her, not softening. "But it's already gone too far." "I didn't know who he was," Vanessa repeated, her defense now sounding weak, even to her own ears. Emily raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp. "So if he were just a regular passenger, would you be fine with it?" Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Emily stepped closer, speaking each word with weight. "The problem isn't just that you hurt him. It's that you showed everyone on this flight how easily someone can be stripped of respect based on nothing but appearance." Her words hit Vanessa harder than any warning from the captain. She looked down at her trembling hands, empty, fragile. The pride, the confidence, the power she once held, all of it had evaporated the moment Leonard Brooks's name appeared in the message from the operations office. And now the crew knew, the captain knew. Soon, the entire leadership team would know every little detail. In the first-class cabin, Leonard remained seated, one leg crossed over the other, one hand resting lightly on his cane, the other still holding the book he hadn't turned a page of for nearly half an hour. But he wasn't waiting. He was observing. He had been in rooms like this many times, not on planes, but in large conference halls where important decisions were made, after hollow apologies. And he knew full well next would come the panic behind closed doors. The hasty excuses, the empty apologies, but this time he wouldn't accept the emptiness. In the row behind the man in the navy jacket whispered to the woman sitting beside him, "Since that happened, he hasn't said a word, has he?" The woman nodded slightly, her voice lowering. "He doesn't need to say anything." They turned back toward the front, the silence between them now filled with respect. In the cockpit, the captain focused on the work of preparing for landing, but his mind wasn't at ease. The report from the operations office was clear. Leonard Brooks wasn't an ordinary passenger. A full assessment was underway. No excuses, no delays. The captain picked up the internal intercom, pressed the button to contact the crew. "Miss Carter, please note. After landing, the ground crew will board. They'll meet with you directly." A heavy silence lingered before Vanessa replied, "Understood, understood. Captain." Emily looked at her cold. "So it's done now." Vanessa nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, it's really over." The plane slowly descended, cutting through thick clouds. With every meter it lowered, the pressure in Vanessa's chest seemed to increase tenfold. She wasn't just preparing to face an angry passenger. She was preparing to confront those who held the power to decide her career. And Leonard, he wasn't just an older man seeking justice. He was living proof that true power doesn't need to shout to change everything. The cabin dimmed under the soft yellow lights as the plane gently glided down toward the brightly lit city below. The flight attendants hurried to check seatbelts, clear away water trays, but this time there was no laughter, no cheerful greetings. Everyone worked silently, as if reenacting a familiar ritual in a completely different atmosphere. That silence wasn't just quiet, it was observant. It was the waiting for something to happen, something that no one aboard could stop anymore. Leonard Brooks remained sitting in his seat, motionless as a mountain before the coming storm. Resting his head gently against the window, Leonard Brooks sat motionless. The soothing hum of the airplane's engines vibrated softly beneath his feet. The book was still open on his lap. The coffee beside it had gone cold, but his posture remained unchanged. His breathing was steady, but his presence seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Without uttering a word, everyone in the cabin knew the silence was heavy and meaningful. Behind him, passengers whispered among themselves in hushed tones, almost inaudible. No one had forgotten what had happened, and now they were all waiting for the conclusion, like those sitting in a courtroom awaiting the verdict. Most didn't know who Leonard Brooks really was. They didn't know that the elderly man before them had once sat in the very councils of power, now silently judging Vanessa Carter. They didn't know that his entire life had been dedicated to fighting for justice in spaces that hadn't welcomed him. But they understood enough. They had witnessed an injustice unfold, and they understood that sometimes calmness and perseverance hold more power than any shout. Up front, Vanessa stood still by the service counter. She had checked all the compartments closed, all the drawers, adjusted her uniform 5 times, but her hands still trembled. Just recently, she had splashed cold water on her face in the restroom, but the reflection in the mirror still showed a pale face and hollow eyes, a cruel reminder. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality. She had made a mistake, and now only minutes before landing, the crew would leave the plane. But she would have to stay. Emily Ward leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed. She had been silent since the captain's announcement, but when she spoke, her voice was low. "Have you figured out what you're going to say?" Vanessa hesitated, her throat dry. "I don't know what they want to hear." Emily frowned, her eyes sharp. "You shouldn't think about what they want to hear. You should think about what the truth is." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Vanessa whispered, repeating the phrase for the 4th time today, like a meaningless mantra. Emily shook her head, disappointment clear on her face. "You saw an elderly black man sitting in first class and immediately decided he didn't belong there. That wasn't following procedure. That was judgment." Vanessa parted her lips to argue, but found no words. Emily continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "I've worked with you for over 2 years. I've never seen you act so quickly with anyone else." He didn't argue, didn't resist, but you just looked at him and made a conclusion. Vanessa leaned against the wall. Her eyes reddened. "I ruined everything." "In just 5 minutes," Emily replied quietly. "In 5 minutes you showed everyone who you really are." "What you do next is what will decide if there's anything left to save." The plane tilted slightly as the wheels touched the runway. The screech of the tires on the surface echoed through the cabin, the engines roaring as the plane turned, causing the cabin to shake lightly. The final announcement sounded, but no one paid attention. No one rushed to retrieve their luggage. Everyone just waited. Vanessa glanced toward the airplane door. Her stomach tightened. Her hands were drenched in sweat. She quickly wiped them on the hem of her uniform. "Do you think—" "I'll be fired?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Emily was silent for a long time before replying, "I don't know." Vanessa nodded slowly, her lips pressed tightly together, her entire body cold. Not from the temperature, but from the deep regret up front. Leonard slowly adjusted his coat, bent down to pick up his briefcase. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no need for him to speak nearby. The elderly woman. Celia leaned toward him, her voice trembling, yet full of respect. "You've been so calm from the beginning. It's truly admirable." Leonard smiled faintly, but his eyes held meaning. "Calmness is something people like me have been forced to learn for a long time." Celia looked at him, her gaze heavy with emotion. "I hope they will treat you fairly." He just nodded gently. "We'll know soon enough." Passengers began to stand, gathering their luggage. But instead of the usual noise, the cabin was filled with soft footsteps and subtle glances, all directed at Leonard. The airplane door opened. 2 men in tailored suits walked in, their name tags displayed on their chests. Following them was a security officer in uniform holding a tablet. They didn't need to speak. Everyone knew who they were there for. Their firm steps led them to row 1A. The man in front bowed politely. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for your patience. We are from the operations office. If you have time, we would like to speak with you after the passengers disembark." Leonard placed his hand on his cane and slowly stood up. "I have time." The man nodded and, along with his colleague, walked toward the front of the plane where Vanessa was waiting. One of the men stopped in front of her, pulled out a small device, and scanned, confirming the information. "Miss Carter, please stay. The security team will assist with the process." Vanessa nodded stiffly. She couldn't speak. Her throat felt dry, like a desert. Emily glanced at her one last time. Her eyes didn't carry any mockery or glee. Just the simple truth: she would have to take responsibility for what she had done. Then Emily turned and walked away, following the crew off the plane, leaving Vanessa standing there facing an unavoidable reality. As each passenger walked past Leonard, their eyes glimmered with various emotions. Some with respect, some with regret, others simply curious. But no one, not a single person, would forget what they had witnessed on this flight. You could see it in their eyes. What they had witnessed on this flight would not disappear just because the plane had landed. It had etched itself deep into their memories, a moment of injustice. The silent power of one man and a storm that had only just begun. Celia, the elderly woman sitting across from the aisle, paused before leaving the plane. She stepped over gently, placing her hand on Leonard Brooks' arm. "I hope you make them feel what you've gone through," she whispered. Leonard responded with a calm nod, his gaze steady. "I don't need to raise my voice. They've already heard me." She smiled faintly, encouragingly, before merging into the crowd of passengers leaving the plane. Now the cabin was nearly empty. Only Leonard remained in seat 1A, a few flight attendants finishing up paperwork, and Vanessa Carter standing rigidly near the galley, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The two men in suits from the operations team returned to the front cabin. One of them approached Leonard this time with a softer tone. "We've arranged a private meeting room to work with you, sir," he said. "We understand this incident caused an interruption, and we greatly appreciate your patience." Leonard slowly stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and nodded, led the way. As Leonard walked off the plane, Vanessa's eyes followed him. He was calm, not a hint of anger. It made her feel even smaller. On some deep level, she had hoped he would shout, scream, or resist so she might have a chance to defend herself. But Leonard didn't do that. It was that silence, that unspoken judgment, that was the heaviest punishment of all. As Leonard exited the plane, the atmosphere shifted again. A security officer approached Vanessa holding a tablet. He checked the information and then briefly stated, "Miss Carter, please proceed to the front cabin. We need to begin the official process immediately." Vanessa silently followed each step, heavy as if dragging her entire body. She sat down in the flight attendant's seat at the front of the plane, her eyes downcast, unable to look directly ahead. The officer began scanning a questionnaire on his device. One of the operations team members sat across from her, his face utterly indifferent. To be clear, he began, his voice steady. "This conversation is not a routine procedure. Miss Brooks has submitted an official incident report. The board has been notified. A full review is underway." "I understand." Vanessa stammered, her voice hoarse. The officer looked up. "We need your personal account. Every word you say, every action you took." Vanessa nodded weakly. "What made you doubt his seat?" the operations member asked bluntly. Vanessa hesitated. The answer burned in her throat, but she couldn't bring herself to say it, that because he didn't look like someone who belonged in first class, that she had assumed. The silence stretched heavier than any confession. "I'm not sure," she finally whispered. "I thought maybe it was a mistake." The man leaned back, his eyes sharp. "Do you think that because of his age, his appearance, or his skin color?" Vanessa felt her throat tighten, her eyes blurred, but she held back the tears. She didn't answer. "Procedures are in place to ensure fairness." The operations member continued, his tone, cutting like a knife. "But you didn't follow procedure. You acted on instinct. And in this case, that instinct was discrimination." Vanessa bit her lip, trying to hold herself together. I didn't mean it," she said. "Intent doesn't matter," the man interrupted, his voice harsh. "We only care about the consequences. And the consequences of your actions may cost this airline dearly." The officer continued to take notes, each word, each sentence time-stamped and stored in the system, preparing to be sent to those who would determine her fate. Meanwhile, in the quiet waiting room outside the terminal, Leonard Brooks sat leisurely, a hot cup of coffee before him, untouched. his leather briefcase still placed at his feet. A senior board member sat opposite him, just finishing his second apology. "We are deeply embarrassed by this incident, Mr. Brooks. We take full responsibility." Leonard sat silently for a long moment before slowly looking up. "I've spent decades of my life trying to build something better," he said softly. "Something fairer. I'm not seeking power for myself. I just hope that people like me don't have to keep proving that we belong anywhere." The board member lowered his head, his voice softening. "We're taking the first steps. Clear responsibilities will be established." Leonard nodded slowly. "I will believe it when I see the actions." Back on the plane. Vanessa sat alone after the interrogation ended. The jet bridge connecting to the plane was empty. The dim cabin lights cast a cold, empty glow, making the space feel even more desolate. The airplane, once a place she had confidently controlled, now felt like a courtroom. She opened the flight crew's electronic device, checked the schedule, and saw her name had been removed from the upcoming flights. A short message appeared. "Under review, all duties suspended until further notice." Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut. The air around her felt cold, or perhaps it was just that she had become cold from within. Just one moment of error, just one hasty decision, and it had swept everything away. Somewhere across the airport, Leonard sat thoughtfully, not angry, not bitter, only a long memory, a persistent ideal, and the understanding that sometimes silence carries more weight than any outcry. And while the airline was scrambling to handle the crisis behind closed doors, the world outside had already begun to ask, what really happened on Flight 417? The story was no longer suspended in the sky. It had begun to echo across the ground on phones and inboxes and on social media timelines. The videos captured by passengers had gone viral. One showed Leonard Brooks standing calmly as he was asked to leave his seat. Another caught the whispers in first class. He showed her his ticket, so why make him leave? By the time Leonard arrived home that evening, a flurry of clips had exploded across the internet. Headlines were appearing faster than he could read them. Older black man asked to leave first class seat. Turns out he's the co-founder of the airline flight attendant. Suspended after incident with VIP shareholder. Another lesson. Power doesn't always come in the form we expect. Inside his quiet home. Leonard placed his leather briefcase on the hallway table, hung his coat on the hook, then sat in silence, in the living room. The silence here was different from the silence on the plane. It wasn't heavy. It was the silence of someone who had fought and deserved peace. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls. He ignored most of them. Only one message caught his attention. A message from his personal lawyer. "The board meeting has been scheduled. The CEO wants your input on the internal restructuring proposal. A public apology is in process." Leonard replied shortly, "Send the draft." In another part of the city, in a dimly lit apartment, Vanessa Carter sat hunched by the kitchen table. Her hair was loosely tied, her uniform jacket draped over the back of the chair. Her employee badge lay face down on the table. Her laptop displayed the company's internal portal, the status blinking for the 5th time. "Suspend pending review. Will contact within 48 hours. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. Every time her phone vibrated, her heart clenched. A few coworkers had sent comforting messages. Some remained silent. But one message stood out from all the rest. From Emily Ward. "I hope you think carefully, because this isn't just about Mr. Brooks. It's about every silent moment when prejudice wins and the way we choose either to break it or become it." Vanessa stared at the screen for a long time before locking her phone. For the first time, she didn't try to justify herself. The excuses she had once made had crumbled before the leaders, her colleagues, and now the public. At the airline's headquarters, in a large meeting room overlooking the city, senior leaders sat around a long table, On the large screens around them, trending topics were clear: Marshall accountability, in their flyfare, Leonard Brooks. The CEO sat at the head of the table, flipping through printed reports. His voice was tense. "We're not just handling a PR crisis. This is a crisis of reputation, and it's happening under our watch." A senior advisor interjected, "This isn't the first time this type of complaint has come up, but this time it's hit someone strong enough to force change." "Good," the CEO replied, his voice cold. "Maybe this is the lesson we needed." He turned to the head of HR. "I want a full review, every complaint ever filed, every flight attendant ever warned for discriminatory behavior, every case that was brushed under the rug." "Understood," the head of HR responded, typing quickly on a laptop. The CEO continued, "And about Leonard Brooks, he's not just a shareholder. His name is on the founding charter of this company. We owe him more than an apology. I want a public statement, clear, no loopholes. Tonight." That evening, the public statement was posted on the company website and all social media channels. "We deeply apologize to Mr. Leonard Brooks and to all passengers who expect fairness, dignity, and respect on every flight. The incident on Flight 417 is unacceptable. We take full responsibility. We are immediately launching bias awareness training, updating our flight operation procedures, and committing to an independent audit of our internal practices. Discrimination has no place in our company." The statement spread like wildfire. Across the United States, people shared the post, comments flooded in. Some supported it. Some were skeptical. But one thing was undeniable. The story had ignited a much larger conversation. At his home, Leonard read the statement on his tablet. He didn't smile, but in his eyes there was a quiet acknowledgement. This wasn't everything, but it was a start. He opened his laptop and began typing. Not a lawsuit, not a complaint, but a detailed plan for reform. The list included mandatory training for all staff, regular internal audits, a customer feedback hotline, and performance evaluations, based on how employees treated all passengers, not just those with status. He titled the document simply, "Accountability Plan, Phase 1, and hit send. Leonard wasn't seeking revenge. He didn't need to be on the news or stand before cameras. What he wanted was something harder, real change. And he knew sometimes the most powerful change begins with a steadfast silence and a simple phone call from a man who refuses to sit back when he has earned a seat at the front. The next morning, things escalated further. Major news channels put the event at the top of their headlines. Talk shows dissected it. Online forums heated up with debates about race, class, respect, and appearances. One television channel aired a short segment. A seat he paid for but still had to prove he belonged. A still image from the airplane cabin flashed. An old black and white photo. A young Leonard Brooks standing with the airline's original founders, his eyes full of resolve. In thousands of homes across the country, people watched quietly, angry, supportive, and telling their own stories. Some tagged the airline, demanding they fulfill their promised commitments. Meanwhile, in the executive meeting room, the airline's leadership sat around the long table. The atmosphere more tense than ever. The CEO walked into the meeting room holding a thick stack of files. Each cover clearly marked Incident 417, Internal Review. Right behind him, Leonard Brooks entered. He didn't come as a guest nor as a victim. He walked in as a shareholder, a voice that the board couldn't ignore. He wore a slate gray suit, his familiar cane in hand. His steps were firm, his eyes sharp, and his demeanor calm. Everyone in the room stood up as he entered. "Good morning." Leonard spoke evenly, then pulled out a chair at the head of the table. "Let's get started." The CEO nodded. "Mr. Brooks first, please allow me to offer a deep apology on behalf of the company. We failed, and we are ready to listen." Leonard leaned slightly forward, his voice not loud, but firm. "I'm not here for comfort. I'm here to ensure this company doesn't just speak correctly, but also acts correctly." He opened the file in front of him. It was the plan he had finished the night before. Accountability Plan. Phase 1 he began presenting. We will redefine respect within this company, not just retraining the crew, but also managers, ticketing staff, and senior leadership. We will implement a real-time customer feedback system, ensuring full follow-up. Success will not only be measured by profits, but by the feelings of passengers when they leave the plane. The room fell silent. The weight in every word he spoke dropped, hitting everyone hard. A board member spoke up hesitantly. What about the flight attendant involved in the incident? Leonard paused for a moment before responding. She must face consequences, but I don't want her turned into a scapegoat. The issue isn't just her, it's the culture that allowed her to act that way without being questioned. He leaned forward, his eyes bright. If you want to save the future of this company, then fix everything, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been judged before. They even sat down. The CEO nodded decisively and turned to the board. We will implement the plan. The entire thing. No delays. Leonard leaned back in his chair, not seeking applause or praise. He simply watched to ensure that what had been promised would actually be carried out. That same day, Vanessa Carter sat alone in another small meeting room. Before her were two representatives from HR and an ethics officer. Her suspension was still in effect. She clasped her hands tightly together, her voice barely audible as she answered each question. Do you understand why your decision is considered discriminatory? One of them asked Vanessa, nodded, whispering, Yes. Is this the first time you've been involved in such a complaint? Vanessa shook her head, her eyes downcast. No. There were 2 minor incidents before. I didn't think. That's the problem. The ethics officer cut in his tone gentle but stern. You didn't think. You acted out of habit. And now that habit has put the company at legal risk and sparked a public crisis. Vanessa didn't argue. She knew she had no excuses left. Her career now hinged on this moment, and there were no drafts left to save her. I want to apologize to Mr. Brooks directly, she whispered. If he agrees. The HR manager responded coldly. That's not up to you. Right now your priority is whether you still have a chance to return. They handed her a file titled Corrective Action Review. Vanessa took it with trembling hands and quietly left the room without another word. That night, Leonard Brooks returned home and opened his email filled with messages. A slew of updates flooded in. The plan has been approved. Press conference scheduled. Mandatory training will be implemented in the next 30 days. He skimmed through each message, supportive words from shareholders. Thank you notes from employees he'd never met. Shared stories from strangers. Thank you for not staying silent. But there was one message that made him stop and linger. The subject line. I'm sorry, Vanessa Carter. The content was simple, clumsy but sincere. I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks. I was wrong. I judged you. I acted with prejudice. Whether I realized it or not, I can't undo the harm I caused, but I will carry it with me. I will change. I am truly sorry. Leonard read it through. He didn't respond. He didn't need that apology to move forward. What he had started, real change, was what mattered. Day by day, the impact of the incident on Flight 417 grew. It was no longer just a murmured story. It had become a benchmark. The crew whispered about it in meetings. Passengers mentioned it as they boarded planes. New policies began appearing in the internal inbox. A new atmosphere spread, no longer focused on the tremors above the sky, but the very real pressure on the ground. We must do better. Leonard wasn't seeking attention. He kept to his usual routine, reading the paper in the morning, working with his legal team on his phone, quietly reviewing implementation plans from the compliance board in the evening. No interviews, no speeches, just action. In the airline's large training center, a massive screen lit up. The new title was clearly displayed: Bias Recognition and Passenger Respect Phase 1. Mandatory training. About 30 crew members sat silently, each with a tablet in front of them. The first lesson was a video clip. In the sharp image, Leonard Brooks sat upright, still in his familiar gray suit, his voice calm. "I've been with this airline for more than 4 decades. I've flown economy class. I've flown first class. I've been treated well, and I've been treated unfairly. What happened to me on Flight 417 wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a habit that got exposed. A habit that decides who deserves to sit where based solely on appearances. That moment, the silent discrimination was not something new. It just happened to be captured by the right eyes at the right time." In the video clip, Leonard Brooks looked directly into the camera, his voice calm. "If you're watching this, you have a chance to do better. Not because of who I am, but because everyone deserves to sit where they belong without having to prove it." When the screen turned off, the room was completely silent. Some crew members lowered their heads. Others looked straight ahead, their faces confused, but clearly reflecting on what had just been said. At the back of the room, Emily Ward stood quietly watching. She had requested to join the training oversight group not for recognition, but because she wanted to ensure this time wasn't just a formality. Vanessa Carter was not present in that training session. She had been placed in a separate extended review program, direct interviews, psychological evaluations, and a probationary phase. Her fate with the airline was still undecided. Her name was no longer on the upcoming flight schedules. But voluntarily, she began the process of self-reform. No one asked her to, but Vanessa joined a local community group dedicated to bias awareness training. In the first session, she said nothing. She just sat and listened, listening to heartbreaking stories from strangers who had been judged belittled simply because of their appearance or accent. She no longer wore her uniform. She wore simple clothes, introducing herself briefly. "I'm Vanessa. At Leonard's house." A handwritten letter was delivered. On the pristine white paper, careful handwriting read, "Mr. Brooks, I do not expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I've begun to understand not only what I did to you, but what I've done to all those who have experienced this. I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm asking for a harder road. The road of learning, relearning, and stopping, pretending I haven't caused harm. Thank you for your silence." It said what I needed to hear. Vanessa Carter. Leonard finished reading the letter, then gently folded it and placed it in the drawer. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. That evening, an email from the CEO arrived in his inbox. The subject was simple: Progress Update Phase 2. Inside training completion rates, new compliance reports, revised passenger complaint procedures, and a draft edition of the Passenger Dignity Protection Clause. To the staff handbook, Leonard replied with just one line: "Continue." Focus on the journey, not just the start. He sat in his office, the sunset casting an orange hue through the window. He thought about his actions. Just one call. Just one refusal to argue. And now through the offices, training centers, and boardrooms, his silence had turned into real action. Not because he demanded it, but because he made them unable to ignore it. A month later, Flight 417 was no longer just a number on a schedule. It had become a symbol not because of the airplane or the destination, but because of the truth it exposed and the changes that followed. Each airline began updating their internal procedures, not because they feared it, but because society had made it clear silence was no longer a safe shield. Passengers demanded fairness. Employees demanded clear guidance. Industry leaders began asking questions they had previously avoided. At training centers, the crew was required to complete practical scenario tests, many directly modeled after Leonard Brooks' incident. His name appeared in internal documents, not as a thorn, but as a flag. A turning point. New employees from day one were taught the difference between enforcing regulations and making judgments, between following policy and bias. As for Leonard, he returned to his peaceful routine. He didn't like the spotlight. He never had. He declined every interview request, every documentary offer, every academic conference. What mattered to him was not the noise. It was the results, and slowly, those results began to blossom like small buds breaking through hard soil. One chilly morning, his phone rang. The board secretary, respectful Mr. Brooks. "We thought you'd like to know. The customer satisfaction report from the past 2 weeks shows a significant reduction in complaints related to discrimination." Phase 2 is progressing well. Leonard listened calmly. "Good. Keep measuring. Don't just announce that afternoon." For the first time since the incident, Leonard booked a flight. The same airline. The same first-class cabin. The same calm demeanor. When he arrived at the airport, the check-in staff greeted him by name. Not because they were warned, not because of the scandal, but because the new system had automatically flagged passengers who had previously been mistreated. To ensure they were treated with dignity, Leonard didn't demand privileges. He accepted the ticket, nodded in thanks, then slowly walked toward the boarding gate. His cane tapped lightly on the polished floor steadily. On the plane, the flight attendant in his cabin, a middle-aged gentleman named Joel, bowed respectfully. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Brooks. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Leonard nodded lightly, his voice calm. "Just let me sit where I belong." Joel smiled. "Of course, sir." He sat in seat 1A, still the same spot. This time there were no scrutinizing glances, no hesitation, no questions, just silence. The right kind of silence. Across the aisle, a young man recognized him, not from the media, not from the rumors, but from the training video. The young man's eyes widened for a second, then softened into respect. He whispered, "I just want to say what you did really matters." Leonard Brooks nodded gently, his gaze calm and steady. Important things always hold value, whether people notice them or not. The plane began to taxi, preparing for takeoff. He opened his book, leaning back comfortably in his seat. No applause, no spotlight, only tranquility. For Leonard, it had never been about revenge, embarrassment, or power. It had always been about dignity, about drawing a final line where a person can say enough. About knowing when to speak up and when to remain silent, letting the world witness, listen, and change on its own. As the plane lifted gently off the ground, cutting through the clouds, Leonard continued to gaze out the window, but not to admire the sky, rather to feel the quiet truth that just one call made by a person standing firm in the face of silent injustice could reach places that thousands of shouts could never touch. He hadn't just reclaimed his seat, he had shaken the very foundation beneath it, and that echo would outlast the flight itself. In a world full of noise and haste, sometimes the thing that sparks change isn't a shout, it's silence. A steadfast, unwavering silence that cannot be ignored. Leonard Brooks didn't need to fight for attention. He didn't need to demand sympathy. He only needed to do one simple yet extraordinary thing: sit firmly in the place he deserved. And from seat 1A that day, he shook an entire industry. If this story has touched you, give it a like, share this video with the people you cherish, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the upcoming heart-moving journeys. We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below.